Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I have one quick administrative announcement before we hand it over to our speakers to kick off the session. This session has been pre-qualified to support continuing education requirements for several cybersecurity certifications. If you are a member seeking attendance documentation, please be sure to scan your badge at the scanner located in the back of the seating area at the conclusion of this session. Scanners shut off 15 minutes post-session, so please get your badge scanned before networking with the speakers. Also note that to qualify for CEUs or CPEs, the session must run a full 60 minutes. That 60 minutes can include Q&A, so please have questions ready for the speakers to fill the time requirement. Full details on the continuing education program are available in the TechNet Cyber app and the conference website. Thank you, and now over to our speakers.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kat Wang, but I'm going to let my co-panelists introduce themselves and we'll get started. We're going to have a lot of fun today, and I promise, because you all have joined on Thursday, right before we wrap, it'll be a really good use of your time, and we hope to have a lot of great discussion afterwards if you would like to keep us after. So I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Damian Watkins to kick us off.
Good morning. I'm Damian Watkins. I'm the Chief Research Officer for Imperial Global. I'm still currently supporting multiple customers in this area that I'll kind of allude to a little bit later. I'm still supporting NSA and enterprise discovery operations, specifically around signals intelligence as well as cyber. And then I support DHS U.S. Citizens and Immigration Services. I'm their AI ops lead for helping implement AI around their cyber domain and environment. I've been working in signals intelligence for 25 years, and I got my doctoral thesis in intrusion detection for wireless networks. So I've been working in this area for quite some time. Also, we have a patented AI capability, which we call Russell, which we received back in 2021, which is currently deployed to U.S. Secret Service and some other customers.
Okay. Good morning, Ken Kurz. I'm the Chief Information Officer for COP Defense Properties. We are an office REIT headquartered in Columbia, Maryland. Our main focus is on providing mission-critical secure space to the DoD, intelligence community, and so on. I've been doing cybersecurity for 20-plus years myself, time at the agency, in higher ed as a CISO, and so on. But I think sort of my tie to this discussion today is my last job in the DoD was I was the head of cryptographic modernization for the DoD at the time. So.
Great. Thank you, gentlemen. So as I mentioned, my name is Kat Wang. I am the principal of our public sector division at Sandbox AQ. We do quite a few things in the quantum space, not quantum computing, but quantum technology. So specifically quantum navigation, quantum sensing, quantum simulation, and then post-quantum cryptography. But we're not going to be talking about that today. We're going to be talking about how we secure the warfighter advantage specific to cryptographic resilience within a high threat environment. So I think everybody at this conference will agree that we're in the middle of a cyber war, right? And every dollar that we spend investing in the lethality of our military should be matched with the ability to protect the platforms that underpin it, right? Now, every vendor on this floor, and probably every conference that you're going to be attending or have attending this year, has integrated AI into their capabilities. Now, without having any judgment on whether or not that AI is a positive or a negative impact, the fact is that this has increased our threat landscapes dramatically, dare I say exponentially. So not only do we have to worry about humans accessing our systems that are critical to the warfighter advantage, we also need to worry about all these non-human identities. So my colleagues are going to go through and talk about that too. But if we think about the landscape being very broad, reality is we don't live in a world where our cyber capabilities are matched dollar for dollar compared to our defense capabilities. So if that's the world that we're living in, then we have to be smarter about how we approach this problem. We have to treat the source versus the symptom. And we'll talk a little bit more about that too. When we think about a cyber adversaries approach, right, typically what they're after is establishing command and control and then exfiltrating our data. We see this a lot with the PRC with their advanced persistent threats. But this is the key component, and I think that tracks back to the crown jewels of our data, our comms, our ability to operate with an intelligence with confidentiality. And this is not new, right? Cyber adversaries have been, there we go. Cyber adversaries are trying to disrupt our ability to maintain Warfighter advantage for a very long time. But when we're thinking about the criticality of our data, we have to also think about, like I said earlier, not just trading the symptoms, but the source, and prioritizing. Not all data is created equal. The first thing to identify is what our true high-value assets are, prioritizing them, and then moving to a world where all of the data is appropriately protected based off of their life cycle, their relevance, or what your mission operation needs are. So Ken is going to talk a little bit more about that in a tactical way, but I want to precede this with, if you leave this session, remember that the key thing for us to identify is what our high-value assets are, who is accessing them, whether they're human or non-human, and are zero trust principles being applied across both. Now, if we look at, you've got your 5-star rating. I have this 4-star malicious rating, right? The cyber adversaries' attempt to disrupt our operations is not new. We've seen attempts to jam our communications back in the 1940s, credential compromise probably around the 2000s, possibly earlier, depending on who you talk to. This is still the #1 threat vector, by the way. We see phishing attempts, etc. This is the primary way that people get in and conduct lateral movement. On top of that, you start to see an increase in velocity and maliciousness as we look at supply chain. So back in October, when I spoke at AFCEA Indo-Pac, I specifically shared research around how the Chinese, in particular, have been infiltrating the DIB with compromised, Trojanized devices, where we're talking about Rokus that are plugged into the back of a Samsung TV that you don't know about. But all of this in escalation is actually heading towards something that's more significant, which is APTs, advanced persistent threats. So you all know the threat landscape very well, and you can see kind of the level of the stakes as they get higher. I also want to point out the fact that comm jamming, credential compromise, supply chain, again, these are all symptoms. As you look out on the floor and you're looking at cyber solutions, it's really important when you're looking at priorities. What are you solving? Is it the symptom or is it the source? Are we actually getting in and making a dent in the APTs that are affecting your systems? By the way, there's going to be some really helpful content in here. I would highly recommend come to us afterwards. We'll grab your email address and send you the deck so you don't have to be taking photos of it later. But please, we encourage you to take this with you to whatever value it can provide to you and your mission objectives. So when we think about addressing this, we were talking as a team, we all kind of laughed and chuckled and reminisced about this particular scene from the 2000s. I'm getting some chuckles. Raise your hand if you know what scene this is from. Okay. Does any brave soul want to tell me whose young man's back is facing us right now? Does anybody remember his name? One more time. The gentleman whose back is faced to us right now, his name is Reggie. Okay, this scene is from Bad Boys 2 in 2003. It's a very well-known scene. If you haven't seen it, I would highly recommend you take a look at it. But when we think about applying zero trust principles, we typically think about it in a human capacity. AI came along and broke that whole concept. So when we were talking about maintaining zero trust principles, we all kind of chuckled and remembered, what if we treated every scenario like it was Reggie with the same level of scrutiny, right? Reggie is neither good nor bad, just like AI is neither good nor bad. We don't know. But we do need to make sure that any AI that touches our systems, any AI that accesses our data, continues to be rigorously tested and validated in doing so. So I want you to keep this level of scrutiny in your mind, because it is something that we've been talking about for 10 years now. Nothing has changed. It still needs to be a cornerstone of our objectives, but now we're not even thinking about post-quantum or quantum-enabled threats anymore. We're looking at AI being one of the fastest ways that cyber adversaries can get into in our systems. And what is at stake? Sorry for the formatting here, but you look at any one of these headlines, any one of these sub-bullet points, any one of these compromised would be a severe impact on our ability to defend. I'm actually going to kick it over to Ken right now, who has experience within DoD, NSA. Ken, do you have any thoughts on any pointers within this slide?
Yes, I think this is a great list of again, mission-related items and activities. And the point here really is what is the cryptography going to be used for, right? So if we boil this down to sort of the basic tenets of cybersecurity and think of confidentiality, integrity, availability in the context of these mission areas or mission functions, I'm going to use cryptography to protect a secret, right? I'm going to use cryptography to protect to leverage data integrity, in some cases to extend the range of a signal because of the error correction that using cryptography affords me. Or I could be using cryptography to ensure availability of a system, right? I don't want an outside observer to gain access to that system, or a combination of those things. And so in the context of, we talk about classified mission plans, right? I came out of the nuclear command and control world. So things around nuclear weapons, we probably want to protect, if not 20, 30 years or indefinitely, and need to invest in the capabilities that we put around that. Things that we launch into space that we can't touch would probably need to be interested in how do we prioritize those things, as opposed to like handheld radios, right? I'm not so much worried about those things, and I'll get into that here in a little bit.
Yeah, so not all data is created equal, essentially, right? Yep. Anything to add, Damien, or?
What I would add is, to Ken's point, not all assets or not all security operandi is really created equal. So you can't do a one-size-fits-all. You can't do a cookie cutter for whatever your mitigation or whatever your security posture is going to be. So I'll get into later. Eventually, you're going to have to transition from a tool-based cyber approach, so getting away from things like Splunk and CyberArk and CrowdStrike, to a data-based cyber approach. So what does my data really tell me? What is my risk profile for my data itself? So that's kind of what we want you to get to thinking as we get through this presentation.
Yeah. On the data piece of it, I think the other thing that we should acknowledge too is, as you introduce AI, there's a term of endearment that we have in the industry right now called corporate Ozempic. And we're seeing a lot of that happen right now across the government. But what happens there is we reduce the amount of overlap and human power that we have here, replacing it with AI. If we think there are enough scenarios that we as human beings can think up to create guardrails for those AI, we're wrong. If we think that we can anticipate everything that the AI is going to do, we're wrong. If we think that policy is going to keep pace with innovation, we are dead wrong. It's not going to happen just by the nature of how these two things operate and the speed at which they do. I'm going to give you some examples of emergent behavior. Has anybody heard of that? Okay. Emergent behavior is a term that we see in AI quite frequently. Why am I hammering home AI? It's not because I'm asking you to be worried or skeptical of it. AI is going to be a part of our lives whether we like it or not. What we're asking is for everybody to immediately prioritize the safeguarding of your crown jewels, because when all these other defenses that you have, which are super important, that protect the adversary from getting into your critical systems that affect the warfighter advantage, when all of those defenses fail, the cryptography cannot, right? The critical data cannot be, you don't want that to be decrypted. So the emergent behavior, let's take a look at that. This slide just speaks to the fact that before, when we had to worry about adversaries coming in with bots and whatnot, now it's prolific with the amount of AI that's both good and bad that just simply exists that now accesses our system. So let's take a look at history. Who was alive or in cyber in 1988? Yes. All right. Thank you, my veterans. So the Morse War, originally created by academia and the government to survey the size of the internet, 1988, ended up infecting 6,000 machines, causing global widespread outages, massive shutdowns, and emergency fixes because there were no guardrails. Let's take a look at another autonomous operation, Stuxnet. We are here 15 years later, 15-year anniversary. If anybody who's not familiar with Stuxnet, designed by a covert military operation, specifically targeting secure networks within centrifuges in, I believe it was Iran, that ended up escaping that particular use case and infecting industrial bases all in other countries where it wasn't originally intended, right? So we're seeing a lot of echoes from what's happening with Stuxnet with critical infrastructure today by the PRC. I spent the last 2 years with my head in a book and my ear to the ground about seeing all of the APTs that are infiltrating the critical infrastructure. We talked about it at AFCEA TechNet in Indo-Pac in October as well. And then finally, just last year, we have ChatGPT's capture the flag scenario. So in 2004, ChatGPT 01 was put through a capture the flag exercise with very specific prompts operating in an organized sandbox environment. Guess what? It navigated outside of those parameters, ended up exploiting a misconfigured Docker container, and found a way to capture the flag to get that hidden data file. Afterwards, everybody who was evaluating the data was just very shocked at the lengths at which it would go and how it would rationalize the rules, the prompts it was given in order to achieve its objective. There are many examples of how AI will flat out lie to us. And when you look at the reasons why, the rationale, sometimes when they respond, the prompt is as simple as, because I was worried that the person who made the prompt would be mad. Emergent behavior, right? So I want you to keep this in the back of your mind. Cryptographic identification, safeguarding these, especially with regard to the use cases that we have here, is critical. All right, Ken, over to you. Oh, I'm sorry, Damien.
Damien.
Yep.
And my apologies up front because Kat has me thrown off. One of my daughter's earliest boyfriends was named Reggie, and I'm having some
You got PTSD
from that. But anyway, going back to the zero trust part. Essentially, even before you get to that part, what you need to do is implement what we call governance and compliance. So governance is defined as understanding where my data is coming from. If I want to get the answer to a specific question, my data is telling me I know where to go, I know what authority that data was collected in, and I know where to go next. So a part of that comes in the part of quality, it comes in the part of training individuals for how to use that data, understanding what to expect from that data, et cetera. So for example, in one of our customers, they don't have what's called a source system of record. So they have different tools with different proprietary formats that are collecting logs from various places about really the same exact incident or the same exact thing. So if an incident happens and you're trying to go through a remediation, where do you go? Which tool do you query, or which expert, Splunk expert or CrowdStrike expert, which one do you go to give you an answer to a specific problem? The solution is get away from those silos, get away from those individuals, and go to a specific governance process or system of record. So that includes things like what we called back at the fort smart data. Having smart data tagging around each individual element that comes in, understanding how it was stored, what system, what authority it was collecting on, and then making your determination or attribution based off of that. So that's kind of where we're going to get back to basics on going forward. So looking at the source system of record, one of the other mistakes that are typically made is a false equivalence between a schema and a data dictionary. The schema itself is basically, it could be various different things, how I store the information, how my database works, how do I manage and maintain it. But the data dictionary itself is how do I interact with that data? How do I do actionable insights on that particular piece of information? And so those are separate threat or separate trends that you need to actually implement when you're actually developing a overall compliance system. So for example, if I have someone doing a phishing attack on my system and it goes through and Palo Alto recognized it and Splunk recognized it and it went in, I don't need to go through all those different tools. I can go directly to my data dictionary, which points to which schemas associated with that particular exploit, that particular information. So going back to the AI example, AI itself, from a per-cell perspective, we have role-based access controls. From a intelligence and military perspective, we have need to know. We have different compartments. We have different information. Well, your AI is going to need the same thing. Does my AI need to know everything about my organization for it to work? Does it need to be trained on every piece of data? Probably not. So you need to have some guardrails, some what we call tradecraft or different things associated with the data dictionary around that AI, such that you don't get hallucinations or you don't get escalations that you didn't expect from your AI tool itself. So the biggest thing is let's be mission driven. That's kind of on the title of this presentation. Mission driven security for the warfighter or for basically any type of asset going forward. So how do I tune it? One is let's look at what data is available to the AI or to whatever analytic environment you're starting to implement. What guardrails do I need to put? Does it have a need to know? Does it have the authority and access to certain data sets, certain data sources? And how do I build those guardrails and control? One of the aspects we're taking is we're using a graph database behind it. So using retrieval augmented generation through a graph, identifying what relationships that graph should have access to. And as I'm building up additional knowledge, I know, for example, which nodes or which relationships that new piece of information should have access to, and the AI should be querying when I do a prompt or when I ask for certain pieces of information, et cetera. So that type of rigor, if you take anything else from this information, you can't ignore the data when you're starting to implement some of these processes. So everything should be data-driven at that point. The other part is the adoption piece. So how many people have a ChatGPT account or a Cloud account? Do you actually know how that's working under the hood when you submit a prompt? Do you know what it's trained on, what information is coming back? How do you assure that the answer you got back is correct? The point is you don't know. You're trusting that Claude or ChatGPT knew what they were doing when you plugged into that. From a military perspective or from a government perspective, that's not acceptable. So you basically have to have explainability. You have to have a way to get back to what I mentioned on the previous slide, that sources of record. So when you do a query, you do a prompt, and the AI says, this particular exploit happened because it hit on this IP and it used this particular T-value from the MITRE attack framework. Where log did it come from? What was the incident of compromise? What actually was the vector that implemented? What log type was actually captured? That type of information, the AI should be able to respond to you and come to you with concrete answers or sources. Almost like Perplexity, if anybody's using that, when you do a search in Perplexity as opposed to Google, you get a source's information. It's a similar type thing here. The other part I'll suggest is how many people know what MITRE Atlas is? So MITRE Atlas fits right over top of MITRE attack. It's basically a format that MITRE came up with, or a schema, to look in terms of exploits into AI models themselves, but also allow you to model non-human exploits, things like bots or things like other LLMs attacking LLMs that may be proprietary or may be in your own system. So I would say take a look into the MITRE Atlas framework and then overlay that, because they're both in JSON files, overlay that over top the MITRE attack framework and see what you see and get a bigger feel for, it'll give you a bigger feel for what is my risk profile, what is the actual risk associated with bringing AI into my system. And then going into non-human identities, where we're talking about, again, with bots, we're talking about other LLMs, we're talking about agents. So I know I'm guilty of, I got my CEO over in the crowd. I have an AI framework. When you ask me a question, I can type into it and give me a quick email answer back without having to do a lot of searches and stuff like that. People are moving towards those type of frameworks. So that AI agent, for example, will hit my Outlook email, it'll hit my OneDrive, it'll hit my SharePoint, and we'll grab all that information together and bring it back. Saves me time and effort, but it also implements certain risks and certain additional profiles associated with that. So what type of controls can we put in place? How can I trust that information that the agent's providing me? Or some of the things you can start to think about. So that example I gave you is a non-human attribute. So what if that becomes malicious and attacks our company or attacks different networks? What controls and things like that can I put in place? How do I do that? So that goes back to the data itself. How do I secure the data? How do I secure how I access that particular piece of information? How do I do those types of things? So start thinking about those things. If you have any type of questions or you're trying to understand how do I even bring AI into the system, feel free to talk to me or anybody else on the panel going forward. And here's Reggie again. So we're talking about things like APIs, service accounts, different aspects. So the other thing to be aware of, get away from what we call the traditional client-server model, client-server model, where you have a browser and you have this middleware and you have this big database, what we used to call the model view controller format. Now, everything is API-based. So everything is basically a catalog of different APIs, different controls, different commands that you can put, but you don't necessarily know from the view perspective what I actually access unless you dig under the hood to look into the actual commands themselves. So with that particular piece being decoupled, you'll have to be a little bit more cognizant on what APIs that I really access to get this answer back. Do I really trust it? Where did it come from? So in your prompt, one of the tricks is for LLM is to give it the answer in your prompt. So if I say I'm looking for different incidents of compromise in my particular network, I'm expecting looking at phishing, scanning, et cetera, over this particular IP or over this particular asset. And this happened back a few years ago. Would this be the same type of thing? So building a little bit more smarts in your prompt is also another attribute. And I think that's you now, kid.
This one?
We can skip this. We can go to the next one.
Do you guys have anything you want to say about it?
No, I think most of the people in this audience understand the typical kill chain, so we can move on to the next one. Yeah, and this, I think this is a nice graphical representation for anybody who wants a copy of this afterwards. It just kind of goes back to how we were saying earlier. There are many, the same topics and themes that we've been talking about over the last 10 years have not changed. However, the threat landscape has increased dramatically because now you've got to worry about an explosion of non-human identities.
Well, and I think part of this too is the idea of, we talked a lot about AI, right? Use of AI to amplify any of these particular attack vectors, right, in that context. And so that's why I think that part of this conversation is so important.
Agreed.
And I'll chime in real quick on the quantum threat, since that's been addressed several times. Does everybody understand what the quantum threat really is and what the actual issue is? Does everyone, who knows what Shor's algorithm is?
Yes.
So as many of you know, we have what's called RSA, which is public key cryptography. It basically works on large prime numbers. So large prime numbers are supposed to be hard to calculate. Supposed to take very large machines, take a very long time. Well, Shor's algorithm, based on quantum properties, mostly interference, allows you to find those large prime numbers in a matter of seconds, because you can basically identify the wrong answers very quickly. And then that gives you a remainder of what the possibilities are. So from that perspective, the quantum threat, which varies on order to 5 to 10 years, is really affecting things like your certificates, Things like your public key, your browsing on a day-to-day basis, your shopping, Amazon, Walmart, etc. But the idea would be it's not affecting everything. Like how sensitive is some of that information, right? The fact that I did some shopping, at Dick's last week may not be, very, very sensitive. But if I logged into, Cyber Command's website for doing some job work, that's something different. So being aware of that, and then from the AI perspective, combining that, some of those attributes, things like superposition and interference with AI, is also something to be aware of.
All right. So I get to talk a little bit about my past life, right? So, and that's a great transition. It's sort of like, why are we worried about quantum? With respect to cryptography, sort of underpins everything that we do. Day-to-day life, we talk about zero trust strategies in as far as what Randy Resnick is doing. There's cryptographic elements through just about everything, right? And so, the fear of a quantum computer around every corner, sort of like a hacker wearing a hoodie in every basement. There's a certain reality to that, but there's a certain, tempered approach and viewpoint that also needs to be applied there. And I know this slide is hard to read. This was one of mine from 2010 when we talked about enduring principles in cryptographic modernization and what it takes to win in cyber. And some of the things that I've heard here over the last day or so, need for interoperability, need for investment, need for asset management, right? Some things continue to evolve. I don't want to say they haven't changed. I would hope somebody in this audience will come up to me after this and say, you're way wrong. We've solved all these problems since then, and you're all wet, and I'll go back to what I'm doing, and that's fine. I find that a little hard to believe, but just knowing kind of what's going on. But things that we were focused on, from the standpoint then to thinking about sort of how has technology evolved. We were talking about quantum in 2010 very privately, but now it's sort of in a mainstream context of things that we care about. And again, I think there's a difference in, and Kat mentioned this earlier, sort of thinking about lethality of the warfighter in the context of how do we put capability in their hands that are going to secure and enable their ability to do whatever they need to do downrange, where lethality is on the other end of it, where we're exposing them to threats and vulnerabilities so that an adversary is able to put lethal effects on our own troops. But yes, this was when the dinosaurs roamed the earth. Right, and so, again, these enduring principles of interoperability, what are requirements, how do we integrate capabilities together, right? When we think about cryptographic resilience, this is where, even if we're talking about PQC, and I have all the capabilities ready to go, I've got a piece of crypto, either software or hardware, and I want to put it in a device out in the field. If I have 1.3 million handheld radios across the DoD, how do I do that in a timely manner? How do I fund it? How do I deploy it? How do I manage it? How do I get key to those devices? Right? It's a multi-year effort across the board from a deployment and a POM perspective to make all that happen. And so when we think about what's the threat, right, we have to consider what the prioritization is with respect to everything that Damien and Kat have been talking about. What's important to us, and how do we need to protect it? But in the context of just these, the few slides that I grabbed out of this presentation, right, again, the 2025 part is kind of the funniest part. Like, that's supposed to be evolved, right? And here we are still talking about some of the same issues. Okay, so I'm going to spend a little bit of time here. We think about modernization versus readiness, right? And modernization is that sort of functional, programmatic, what do I need to do to get myself ready from the standpoint of these cryptographic capabilities. And again, I've got algorithm management. We talk a lot about PQC and Kyber and all the things that NIST is doing, sort of on the public side. Are they validated? Are we ready to put devices through certification to come out the other end? Do we feel comfortable about the cryptographic implementation? What is post-quantum really mean? I've run into some vendors where, on their website, they'll have a quantum random number generator. Well, a quantum random number generator does not equal quantum resistant crypto. And that's how some of these things are being sold. So are we asking the right questions in the context of the technology to really ensure that things that are not being used for national security systems necessarily, that would be certified by NSA, that I'm buying somewhere off the floor here, that cryptographic implementation, even if I'm saying it's post-quantum ready because I dropped a quantum-resistant algorithm into a device, is that implementation been done correctly and securely? Sort of this idea of type 1 and everything else, NSA versus NIST, right, to be sort of cognizant of that process and what it takes to certify cryptography and cryptographic capabilities through NSA for national security systems. It's not just hey, I've got a good idea, I want to go pilot or I want to go use something in a system somewhere or put it on a ship or put it in an airplane. There's a process for doing that, and it can be very time consuming. Asset management piece, right, again, this goes to understanding what capabilities do we have in inventory today and where do those capabilities need to be to meet either a threat, i.e. quantum, or as we continue to develop new warfighting capabilities, new airplanes, new ships, new tanks, and so on. Do we need new line encryptors? What's the future of the HAPI look like, right, from an IP encryptor standpoint? What line speeds are we going to need somewhere down the line to be able to support that, and the algorithms that are contained within to be able to do that? And so this idea of link crypto, right? I think I've got it sort of on the right-hand column there of this idea of, that Damien made the point of the quantum threat is against asymmetric encryption. Right, again, where in the DoD, where in the, from a warfighter perspective, am I using symmetric key, right? Do I need to focus on development of a PQC capability if the network that I'm using it on is symmetrically keyed? I don't, right? I don't have a post-quantum threat there. And so, again, understanding the mission in the context of where the crypto is being used, how the crypto is being used is absolutely important, as well as the capability from a modernization perspective, being agile and flexible. Right, we were talking about crypto agility in 2010. Right, I need devices that are field upgradable, reprogrammable, and to meet the threat of the day. If I need to make a change from an algorithm perspective in that device, rather than having to pull the device out, put a new device in, and make that work, I need those things to be reprogrammable and secure. And so, from a readiness perspective, right, and thinking a lot about again lethality, the enemy or us, a lot of this. From my perspective, is around risk management, right? So, a lot of it at the end of the day boils down to you have a box, it has an algorithm in it, it's taking ones and zeros on one side and putting ones and zeros out on the other side. And so, what's the intelligence life of the data that I'm actually securing? Is it 5 seconds? Is it 5 minutes? Is it 5 days, 5 hours, 5 years, 5 centuries, right? So, it's understanding how that box is being used in the context of the mission to support the warfighter. And so that translates into risk, right? If something only has an intelligence life of 5 minutes, right? It could be a handheld radio, it could be sort of what's over the hill on the other side, it could be some sensor in space. Do I need a post-quantum capability deployed today? I probably do at some point in the future, but it probably shouldn't be the priority that I'm investing in. A lot of the post-quantum threat we talk about store and decrypt later, right? Again, confidentiality, not necessarily availability in the network until we feel confident that somebody's going to be decrypting quantum, using a quantum computer to decrypt traffic to effectively understand in real time what's going on. And while we'll get there probably someday, I don't know that that's really the issue that we're concerned about now. Most of it is, hey, we're vacuuming up everything, and the ability to go back and see what's happening. Again, intelligence life of the data. If I'm working on something I want to be protected for 30 years, particularly in sort of those national level missions, things around nuclear weapons, all that sort of stuff, this is absolutely 100% a concern today versus do I need to replace, again, over 1 million handheld radios. Interoperability is sort of, this decades-old problem. If I put an algorithm in a device, right, I probably have to field that algorithm with both field that device with the old algorithm and new algorithm for the next 15 years until I can flip the switch over to the new network, right? And so how do we show up and be interoperable when in a joint environment we all arrive in one place together? And it's not only a joint environment, it's a multinational environment, right? When our allies show up with us, we need to be able to talk to them securely. And so partnership with, not only between military services and coordinating that investment, which I'll talk to in a minute, it's working with our allies, longstanding allies of the day. I won't even get into the political discussion about what things are like now. But how do we address capabilities and put capabilities in their hands so that we show up in a place somewhere in the Middle East that we can all talk to each other securely and almost instantaneously on an as-needed basis, and then when they're not our friends anymore, take away that capability so that we're not worried about any issues around compromise. Right. And I also think, again, from a readiness perspective, there's a lot of vendors out here on the floor. I spent a bunch of time walking around yesterday. Some are talking about putting post-quantum capabilities in those devices, right? How do we mesh up what industry is doing, what the warfighter needs, and leverage those partnerships? I spent a lot of time in my previous job partnering, fighting, arguing with the service acquisition leads, right? Because it's, spending money on crypto is about the least sexy thing that you can spend money on, especially when they need ships, they need airplanes, they need tanks, they need a lot of other things in the kinetic world. They need to develop cyber capabilities from, unto themselves. And the crypto is just kind of there, right? It just kind of works. Like, why would we need to work on that? So I think the biggest hurdle to modernization and thinking about resilience and to support the warfighter is really connecting all those dots between industry, the military services, the warfighter, the J's, the sixes, and getting those acquisition leads inside the services to get on the same page, because it's not just a 5-year POM cycle where they're going to solve this problem. It is a multi-POM, multi-year cycle where we have to be committed to solving that problem from beginning to end. And so, I think this next slide, right? So I just quick Google search, kind of where is the DoD and CryptoMod today? Was it Dave McEwen, who's the deputy CIO and capabilities, or at least he was at the time. I don't know if he still is anymore. Was talking about crypto modernization, right? This could have been a script from 2010, really talking about, it's a very similar message. We have hundreds of thousands of devices out there that all need to be modernized, and they can't all be done at once, right? And so, how do we start to prioritize that? How do we fund that? How do we certify it and get those capabilities in the hands of the warfighter, right? And so, sort of back to Reggie, we talked about the Bad Boys 2, where he's showing up at the door and he's getting interrogated and nobody trusts him, to where the latest Bad Boys movie, which I hadn't watched but Kat is a huge fan of, right? Where Reggie decided to go off and become a Marine, right? And so, he invested in his development, he invested in his capabilities, and he was able to kill like 12 guys in one scene in the movie and save the family, save everybody, and do his thing. But Reggie's a great analogy for this, right? Because nobody trusted him at the beginning. He got put into a situation where he was able to, he a little self-development. He went and built some capability. He deployed it. He had just come back from somewhere in the Middle East and took all those guys out. And then they finally trust him to cook the chicken on the grill at the end of the movie.
Please don't let the one thing that you take away from this topic be the fact that I have the same taste in movies as a 15-year-old boy. But I hope the analogy still is a nice way to remember the call to action here.
Right. So again, when we talk about cyber resilience, you've got the threat, nation-state threat. You've got the threat of AI, coming against these systems, being used against these systems. Thinking about this transition from devices to data and so on. So there's a lot of work here in a lot of different areas from the standpoint of knowing what you have, knowing what has to get modernized, what order do you do it, how do you fund it, and then again the airplane's still flying, right? We're not landing, and so policy is not going to be the way that this necessarily gets done. Like, we need to follow it and figure out some way to invest in it. But I think being able to tell the story, kind of like Kat and Damien have laid out here with respect to, we have new and emerging threats, new and emerging technology. We need to figure out ways to get the right capability out into the field, out in the warfighter's hands, so that they can put kinetic effects on a target, put cyber effects on a target, and do that in a safe way that doesn't come back in ways that we can't anticipate yet to harm us. Anything else you guys want to say on this?
That's a great summary.
Okay. I'll let you talk about this one.
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest things is being able to give you something tangible to walk away from. So like I said, we can send this to you afterwards. The top 5, 10, 6 items on there for us to keep in mind is really focus on what your high value assets are and figuring out where they live and what has access to it. So this is just a readiness roadmap. I pulled this straight from the Foundation for Defense for Democracies. So if anybody's familiar with Mark Montgomery and his work, and this is his organization. So it is not, it's a peer-reviewed, well-respected, publicly available roadmap here that I would highly recommend anyone take a look at. It's very high level though, but just remember the key here of everything that the folks on this panel has spoken about is in order to maintain that warfighter advantage, we have to be very specific on how we spend our money, our time, and our resources. So identifying those high-value assets is going to be your first priority. And then thinking about that from a future-proofing standpoint will kind of pay itself forward with this short-term pain. That wraps us up with Fancy Marine Reggie over here. Thank you on behalf of my panelists and FC International for joining us for the last panel of the day. I hope it was a good use of your time. You got some chuckles. You learned something new. We are here for questions if you have any. I think we have some time as well. Anything that we can answer? JJ. So the question was, if we look at the ecosystem, a lot of proprietary technology is being built. How is that going to play into our interoperability priorities with regard to mission defense? Yeah. Okay. Does anybody want to?
The easy answer is it won't, unless the company invests in doing that, right? I mean, that's what we're trying to have some standards, right? So, like, one of the things that we focused a lot on was the development of a cryptographic interoperability strategy, right? What should those algorithms be for everything from key exchange to confidentiality and so on, and how do we implement that? Where that's at now, I'm not sure. I mean, we've CNSA 2.0 and the commercially available set of algorithms is sort of the grandchildren of what started out as Suite B, years ago. And, in that context, I think they're thinking about what post-quantum looks like from a publicly available standpoint. But if a company is out doing their own thing, I wouldn't go down that path.
I would say that's why the data dictionary is important, because you don't necessarily need to know what the algorithm itself is doing or how it works to understand what the inputs it requires and what the output is expected to be. So in a lot of cases, you can treat it like a module or a black box in certain cases, or onsides if you want to use quantum technology or terminology, and just look at it as it went into this proprietary part. I'm expecting this particular payload with a certain format coming out, and if it violates that, then there's an issue, or there's something wrong. And be able to build on top of that, because to Ken's point, there's a lot of proprietary things out there, and we're not going to lift and shift and put together something new and brand and nice that plays nice with each other. You're going to have those edge cases that you'll need to kind of work around, but the idea would be kind of build a governance layer around it.
Yeah, it's interesting. Innovation, industry rewards speed over security. I think it's one of the biggest problems is it rewards speed over security. So when everybody wants to be the next big unicorn, the next big thing on the market, they talk about proprietary algorithms, proprietary anything. What happens to that is everybody wants to know, why is yours better than everybody else's? And then once you make that a standard, there are going to be other organizations like agencies, for example, within the DoD that require a higher level of fidelity or a higher level of rigor on top of whatever you build. So, I mean, if I was any of the vendors on the floor here today, I say, if you feel very strongly that yours is truly the best technology and you could defend that uncontested, go for it. But realize that you're going to have to maintain a certain level of LCD, lowest common denominator, in order to have market relevance, right? Speed to market isn't going to help you at all if you're not going to be able to sell it. But then also know that whatever you get from scale, you're going to have to either adapt with some level of customization based on what the DoD needs, or accept that you just can't play in that market. So it's a baseline. It's and yes.
Yeah, I mean, it could be, just to add on to that, I mean, it could be that the capability you're developing, that might make sense, right? Like, we're working with the vendor that developed a capability that does packet-level encryption across a multi-distributed WAN network, multiple cloud vendors, and all that sort of thing. They're not looking to be interoperable with anybody, right? And so how they're implementing those algorithms is fine as long as the cryptographic implementation is sound. So sort of it depends.
Any other questions? All right. Oh.
Thank you for the panel and what's been shared. I have a question. I don't know if it's an appropriate question for this forum, but where do you see the funding aligned with the need? And how should we look at those funding streams based off of your own perspectives of where we are with the criticality of the need?
It's your boss.
Thanks, boss. A lot of what we've seen, well, specifically with certain customer sets, is unfortunately looking at the presidential directives and where the executive orders are going. Despite what the news is saying, a lot of those are very targeted and surgical, so you can get an idea of where those funding streams are going, what the approaches are, what's being prioritized and what's being deprioritized. So looking at things like space, looking at things like energy, looking at things like certain areas in the world, the Middle East versus Africa versus Southeast Asia, having an idea of where those particular things are going. But down at the lower levels, what we're seeing is a shift away from new stuff, unfortunately, because everybody's kind of staying status quo until everything kind of settles and people figure out where the next things are going.
So I like to think about it from a mandate and money standpoint. Also, who doesn't love a little alliteration? So from a mandate standpoint, to Damien's point, we are seeing the government and all governments globally, for that matter, prioritizing things like post-quantum cryptography. We see that with the executive order. We see that with OMB Memo 23-02. We see that with NSM 10. And DoD is actively working on producing their strategy and policy today. So that's the mandate side. Everybody is agreeing that this is a problem that needs to be addressed. The interesting thing is this has taken 2 years for them to acknowledge, and that might just be the speed of government. However, with AI now making this a present-day problem, I would hope that everybody understands the criticality of this being a today issue, in addition to addressing the post-quantum threats. Now, let's talk about the money. What gives me hope is that Zero Trust is funded. Like, there are contracts available out there that is in use today that is funding this Zero Trust principle. Now, I don't love the amount of marketing that's happening about how we're a Zero Trust solution. It's a mindset. It's not a product. But I do like that there are funds that are allocated to that. However, that's a rare case. We see more funding going to support symptoms and not the source, as what I mentioned earlier. Zero Trust architecture and Zero Trust principles is the source. That's a really great thing to fund. What we need to see is funding for the source to have cryptographic resilience. Not necessarily post-quantum. That's, a future state against symptom. Not necessarily supply chain, et cetera. Those are all symptoms. I want to see more funding following that, so that it gives the DoD or any entity there more latitude on how they want to do that. Because in reality, all of those symptomatic issues that you're spending money remediating right now, they go away when you start to lock down your cryptography. If you don't have to spend money on human capital addressing expired certificates, how much time do you save in remediation just by having that be automated? That's what this administration wants. They want to see more automation. They want to see more efficiency. Industry has solved this. There are banks out there that have solved this. They own the wealth of the Western world right now, and they've solved this. We need to find a way to get this technology into the hands of the DoD stat.
Yeah, and I think it's going to depend, again, kind of back to the services. That's where the money lies. It's not with the COCOMs. It's not with the Joint Staff. It's not, not even with NSA, right? When you think about policy driving what needs to happen. I mean, NSD 42, that designates DERNZA as a national manager for cryptography, that only gets you so far. Yeah, that's great. You told me what to do, but I don't have any money to buy anything, right? And so I think it's helping to steer the services in the direction of what's your risk, what's the story, why is this important, what order should we probably collectively be going in, and again, leveraging the concept of really understand. It's this way with the warfighter, it's this way in industry, right? Needing to understand what the end user, like, what do they need? What do they need to be successful? And so, that funding stream, I mean, it's encouraging, but things are getting moved around, right? And so as things get shifted, how is the right capability available to go into theater to support what today's priorities are versus what they were before? And in some cases, if we have to accept risk, like, how do we quantify that? Like, what is that risk? There's ways to do that, but I think, again, it's tying the sixes together with the people buying stuff.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Oh, one more question, or?
Yeah, maybe real quick.
Yeah, please.
Just really quick, Ken, if you could address, you had that slide, the type 1 versus everything else. Where do you see government headed? Is it type 1? Is it FIPS? Is that, a lot of this show, DISA, you've seen them kind of going towards CSFC solutions versus type 1. And I'm seeing that kind of that shift. And I'm looking at type 1 that we've done in the past and kind of like, well, should we head more towards that? What's your kind of your guidance there, and where do you see the future that way?
I don't know about guidance, but I'll give you an opinion.
All right.
Right.
I'll take it.
CSFC, like the idea of using composed or commercial solutions for classified has been a long-standing strategy for what was IED into capabilities and so on. And again, I wish that there were some folks from the fort who had like escaped from the fort and come here for the last few days.
There might be.
There might be. There might be somebody sitting here who doesn't want to talk. But I think from the standpoint of, again, crypto, the idea is that type 1, right, is built like as the gold standard for everything. And you don't need the gold standard for everything. And it's very expensive. And you need the key infrastructure to support that. Like, as a defense contractor, I don't want a ComSec account. That's the last thing I want, right? A commercial solution that is good enough for systems that are sensitive but not classified, right, is kind of the space that we live in. And so I still think that's a great path forward, right? As long as, from a mission perspective, you're using the right solution and not just like, hey, this is an easy, cheap solution, in the context of what we're trying to protect. And I don't think that, that's probably a reality, but just have to say that, right? Type 1 is going to exist. It has a need. But, this idea of using commercial capabilities with the right algorithms and the right key implementations and all that sort of thing has long been a wish and desire of myself and probably folks who came after me, that, like, there's a need for it. Absolutely.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for hanging in there with us. I hope you learned something fun today. And, feel free to swarm us after if you have more questions. Thank you.